Hello and a very warm welcome to our latest Euronews virtual debate, coming to you live this time as part of our special week of coverage as part of Mobility Week in Europe. Apologies for the slight delay in starting. We had a few technical issues, but we have overcome those now, I'm pleased to say. My name is Damon Embling. I'm a journalist with Euronews, and I got the great pleasure of hosting and moderating this session this afternoon. So what are we talking about today? Well, of course, it's all about mobility, and the big mobility question we're asking is green mobility. How can Europe accelerate a zero-emission future or a net zero future, whichever way you look at it? We've got a great panel of guests lined up to discuss this question this afternoon. Without further ado, let's introduce them. First of all, let's go over to Brussels in Belgium and say hi to Herald Ruijters, who's the acting Deputy Director General at DG Move at the European Commission, looking after everything mobility and transport at an EU level. Hi to you, Herald.
Good afternoon, Damon.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Also in Brussels today, we've got Sigrid de Vries, who's the Director General of the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, also known as the ACEA. And of course, Sigrid is going to be talking about cars. Hi to you, Sigrid.
Hello, good afternoon.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. In Leeds, in the UK, across the channel, we've got Jillian Anable, who's a Professor of Transport and Energy at the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds. Hi to you, Jillian.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Great to see you there. Nice to have you on our panel today. And last but not least, in Geneva, in Switzerland today, we've got Hemant Mistry, who's the Director of the Net Zero Transition at the International Air Transport Association, also known as IATA, of course, talking about planes and aviation today. Hi to you, Hemant.
Hi, and good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks very much indeed to all of you for joining us. Now, to all of you in our audience, thank you very much indeed for joining us wherever you are in the world today. We'd love you to get involved in the conversation as well. If you have any questions or comments for any of the panelists that you can see on the screen here, just leave those in the chat box just below the video screen where you're watching, and we'll get some of those comments and questions to our panelists a bit later on. So let's get stuck into the conversation. Let's set some context, first of all. Jillian, at the University of Leeds, I'd like to go over to you, first of all. Of course, mobility and transport is a lifeblood, isn't it? It powers economies, keeps us all on the move. But traditionally, it's also been quite damaging for us, the environment, congestion, things like that. Just set the scene for us about how damaging it has been and why this sustainable transition in mobility is so important.
Yes, it's challenging on a number of fronts. So one of the main reasons for that is because still, even today, between 95 and 100% of all movements that are done in motorised vehicles globally are still powered by fossil fuels. And it's the combustion of fossil fuels that creates most of the nasties, if you like. So certainly, the one that we hear about a lot is carbon emissions. Those emissions contribute to climate warming, and the sector as a whole is responsible for between a fifth and a quarter of global carbon emissions. So in most Western economies, it's about a quarter of the responsibility that it has. But also there's air quality, and air quality is, or air pollution is caused by other pollutants, so not carbon, but things like nitrous oxides and particulates. And because transport is burning the stuff that it's burning in places where people are a lot of the time, in the streets that we're walking around in, next to homes and buildings and schools, then it means that transport, even though there's lots of other sources of air pollution, transport is actually a really big problem. So at least half the problem in these problem places where the air is poor. And so they're the main two things. But, you know, even if we, unfortunately, it has to be said, even if we got rid of all the fossil fuels out of the system, we've got issues around where we find the materials for all the vehicles, all the tyres, where we get the land, enough land for roads and parking and so on. So there are other issues, but obviously the main thing is to try and get rid of the fossil fuels.
Jillian, thanks for setting the scene there. Herald at the European Commission, Jillian there saying mobility, a big problem in Europe, a big contributor to environmental issues. Obviously, the Commission and individual national governments in Europe, they're under huge pressure at the moment over climate change, over big questions about things like energy going forward. How seriously is this being taken at an EU level?
as seriously as can be. You know that our president launched a Green Deal a few years ago, and we have a new mobility strategy. And we are deadly serious about it because we have been launching legislation for decarbonizing transport, the difficult to abate ones like the maritime and the aviation sectors, but also all the others. And we want to be sure that by 2050 we are at the net zero for those emissions that Jillian was referring to. It is not going to be easy, but I can think that we have made a huge step as a continent. If we look at the fact that we have adopted the climate law, that we have adopted this Fit for 55, as it is said, package, which will ensure that we go all along the path that is necessary. But I would like to stress that, yes, transport may be seen as a problem, but it's also a solution, because it also means connectivity. And it also means that our economy can flourish. And you see also with the war in Ukraine that is what is really indispensable.
Okay, Sigrid, you're representing the car industry this afternoon, being described as a big problem, a contributor to the environmental issues that we have in Europe. I mean, the car industry is on a huge transformative journey at the moment, isn't it, in terms of new types of cars, autonomous driving, electric, digital connectivity. Where is the big focus right now for you?
Oh, it's indeed a massive transformation, as you say. The EU is indeed the only region in the world that has a 100% CO2 reduction target for cars taking effect already in 2035. And that means indeed a de facto phasing out of the combustion engine car that the colleague from Leeds was talking about. So cars running on diesel and gasoline. And that in turn means a complete overhaul of the manufacturing facilities. We're going to batteries instead of engines. We need new supply chains. You need entirely new skills for those employed by the industry, over 30 million people working in the transport industry at all. So that often has a huge impact on local economies and communities. And it also means a complete shift in how we're actually using our cars. And we need to charge them, which often take longer than refueling. We need charging spots. They need to be available. We need the electricity grid to be up for this. And we also need the electricity to be green. So it's a huge transformation, and I think we're on the right track. What we have in place is a regulatory framework. What we're missing, though, is a clear business case, if you like, not only for industry but also for society, because we're not synchronized. It now needs to happen. We need to scale up. The first move is not so difficult, and we're good there. 1 out of 5 of every new car is now having a plug, and we're moving fast to get that number up. But the big challenge is really to scale to the 50 and the 100% of new cars being zero emission. That's really a massive challenge. And if we are honest, today no one is really up to this in society. So we really need to do much more and work together to get there.
And we'll talk more about those challenges in a moment and some of the possible solutions coming forward for that. But Hemant at the IATA Association, representing aviation this afternoon, just as we set the context for this debate, I mean, how serious are airlines about cleaning up mobility and going forward? Where's the focus for you?
So, I mean, I think it's very fair to say that there is a very genuine will and commitment towards net zero 2050. We as IATA, we represent over 290 member airlines across the globe. That's over 80% of the global passenger traffic. And in 2021, we were able to secure a commitment across the membership for net zero 2050. And then in 2022, we were able to work with the International Civil Aviation Organization for the long-term aspirational goal. So as an industry sector, and we are a global industry, of course, we have the pledges and the commitments to actually move forward. And talking to our airline members and the work we're doing with our airline members, as I say, there is a lot of focus on transition to sustainable aviation fuels, which of course is the biggest lever we have towards net zero 2050. But we're also looking at all opportunities in terms of aircraft technology, improvement in efficiency. We're looking at new energy solutions, hydrogen, and various other aspects as well. Basically, we don't want to leave any stone unturned. We need to move forward as quickly as possible. And as Herald already pointed out, we are one of the hard to abate sectors. So we really need support in terms of the energy companies providing the right solutions as well. So we can ramp up in sustainable aviation fuels. But of course, we need markets.
Yeah.
We need competitive markets as well to provide solutions for us as well going forward.
We'll talk more about those fuels in a moment and where you're going to get them from in the future. Now, it's interesting because your job title is Director of the Net Zero Transition at IATA. Why isn't it the zero-emission transition?
Well, because of the solutions we have, in some cases there will be net zero. We're looking all across the supply chain. We're looking what we would call well to wake. So as already mentioned by Jillian as well, we need to look at the overall life cycle of how the different products are actually developed and what the actual output is, in this case, from the tailpipe of the airplane as well. So in some cases, there will be net zero, but we're still trying to push forward in that. In other cases, if we look at new energy solutions, we actually have zero carbon solutions as well. We have to look at the package of all solutions.
Okay, Herald, at the European Commission, we hear about all sorts of numbers, all sorts of targets being bantered about by governments and different industries. Net zero, zero emission. What are the big targets that you're working towards right now? Just spell them out for us in mobility. And how are you trying to take people with you on that journey?
I think one of the big targets that is clearly visible is the outcome of legislation of our DG Klima colleagues, which is on the zero-emission cars as of 2035. So no fossil fuel vehicles to be sold after 2035. And then I talk about cars and vans. We are still talking and negotiating about the trucks and the buses. And that date, of course, is very, in the broad public debate, it means that as of that date, such vehicles are not to be sold anymore. It doesn't mean that you cannot use such a vehicle anymore. For that, we are, of course, well aware that we need to launch the date very early, which has been done and which is very concrete. I think that date is absolutely there. We, of course, have also the end date of 2050 that I already mentioned in my opening statement. So what is needed, Damon, is a good coherence between policy and also society, citizens, and industry, so that we have a long-term path that everybody can play into. What we do from Commission side is not just leave that in legislation only. We have set up alliances, for instance, on renewable and low-carbon fuels, on hydrogen and batteries, and others. We also have elements of, I would say, pushing this whole change. For instance, the point that was mentioned by Sigrid on recharging and refueling. There we have a facility in place with a budget of 1.5 billion now, and which will be topped up to make sure that we have a rollout and that everybody in the future, citizens and business, can be sure that you can find easily and that you can also use easily such recharging and refueling points. So it's not just about law, Damon, it's also about all the accompanying elements.
Jillian, how useful are targets and all these numbers that are bantered around? I mean, how meaningful are they? I mean, and let's point to the example yesterday in the UK, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, delaying the ban on petrol and diesel cars by 5 years. People saying it's a U-turn, the government saying it's not a U-turn, but probably is a U-turn. There are problems with these targets, right?
There are problems, but let's first start to say that they can be very useful. Actually setting out a timeline, really trying to agree on a timeline, on a scientifically based timeline, on a timeline that business can sign up to, is extremely important, because then what can come after such a target are certain bits of legislation, regulation, whatever. Once you've agreed the principle, you can get those things in to back that up. So I think they can be very important. I think if we just take the case of the 2035 target, which is in Britain, or wherever it's been set, we've had slightly different target in Britain to Europe until yesterday. The issue with that target actually has been that it's set our sights on a kind of cliff edge in 2035. What really matters for carbon emissions is the average CO2 of the fleet between now and then. So if we continue to sell lots and lots of really quite, let's just say, gas guzzling cars between now and whenever the target is, 2030 or 2035, those cars are going to be on our roads into the 2040s. And when you do the modelling, that's more important than the end date, target date itself. And so what these targets have have actually done is allowed us to take our eye off the ball of the metrics and the things that are really important with regards to the total amount of CO2 that we're going to produce between now and any target date. So they can be very useful, but they can also then deflect the argument towards something and you know, sort of take our eye off the ball of some of the things that aren't important. So it's a mixed picture.
Sigrid, what do targets mean to you in the car industry, and what do you think they mean to the end consumers? I mean, are they really meaningful?
Well, they're incredibly important because indeed they give you that point on the horizon to work towards. And I think the actual point that we're all together working towards is decarbonized economy society by 2050. And that indeed then, you know, translated back into targets for cars, for passenger cars and vans, to be a zero tailpipe emission in 2035. So they are important, but I agree with Jillian that, you know, it can create a false sense of security, and often the discussion and also becomes rather dogmatic. Are we going to make that target? Are we not going to make it? Should it be delayed? Should it be anticipated a bit? What you saw yesterday with the announcements in the UK, whereas I think we should together way more worried about and also more occupied with how are we actually getting the job now done? Because Herald described, I think, indeed, the regulatory framework that is there, but that in a way is only black ink on white paper. And what we are now in need to do is implement it. And in this case, because it's not just an issue of vehicle technology. It's really all of society having to play ball. You need the framework conditions on the manufacturing side, but also on the implementation and the use side. So you need everybody to chip in and work together. And that's where we are critical, because we have started with putting targets on paper in law for vehicle technology in this case. But the infrastructure deployment is lagging behind. There is indeed the alternative fuel infrastructure regulation, but it came really late. First targets, then those infrastructure objectives. And the rolling out still needs to happen. And it's already clear today that it will probably fall really short, not just of expectations, but of what is really needed. Because people, for them to change their mobility habits, they need a sense of security. They need to know that they can charge, and not everybody can do that at home. They also need to know that they can travel the distances that they need to travel. So we need to enable this change, giving a sense of security and comfort, and there's the affordability elements as well. And I think that we really now need to focus on that, how to implement, how to get it done, get away a bit from the sometimes emotional or dogmatic debates about targets and whether we're meeting them or not. I think the direction of travel is very clear. Let's now get it done.
Hemant, at the IATA, the Aviation Association, I mean, at the end of the day, car makers, airlines, you're all in it to make cash, right? Your businesses, you want to make a profit. It's easy to talk the talk, but more difficult to walk the walk.
Indeed, yes. So just following up on the discussion, you know, for 2050, it sets basically the pathway we need to move forward on. And so we spent a lot of time, actually an enormous amount of time recently, mapping out how we can get to net zero 2050 from a bottom-up basis. So what are the individual elements? How can they contribute towards carbon abatement? And how does it all add up to an industry moving towards net zero 2050? So that's a level of work that's required. I completely agree with Sigrid. You know, if we set targets interim, any targets we set along this path, that's where the work starts. That's not the end of the journey itself. So you know, so if we have, for example, and I think we'll talk about it, if we have a mandate in European legislation for something, then the work starts as to how you can actually get there. What do you do to facilitate that journey? And that's I think something we all need to bear in mind.
Thank you, Hemant. If you're just joining us in our audience, thank you very much indeed for joining us for this virtual debate. We're asking the question, green mobility, how can Europe accelerate a zero-emission future, or net zero future, whichever way you'd like to look at it. If you have any questions for any of the panelists, do get involved in the conversation. Leave them in the chat box just below the video screen. I'd like to go back to Jillian now at the University of Leeds in the UK. Jillian, we've already had a few mentions about technology and innovation so far during this debate, but I'd like to delve into that a little bit more. How important is tech and innovation in driving the mobility transition? And what are some of the challenges around that?
Oh, how to answer that one? Well,
in 1 minute.
Absolutely vital, absolutely crucial. Cannot do it without it. Without technology and innovation. Specifically, we've been talking about in particular sustainable cars and sustainable aviation. That's that on the one hand is a 100% technology issue of getting the fossil fuels out. But when you talk about a particular environmental problem, and particularly if you have a pathway, a target, a time frame, then you have to set the rate with which we can do that technological innovation and actually swap out the old dirty stuff for the new stuff. And it, in a way, it almost comes down to a physical law of nature. There is only so fast you can go.
Yeah.
So in essence, at the moment, we have a lot of the solutions. We have them, but that doesn't mean we can actually rely on them in time to do what we need to do for what the science tells us we need to do, and in the timeline we need to do it in. And so what that comes down to is when you run the models, you have really sophisticated models linked to the energy system, so you understand how green the electricity is going to be at a given point in time, how much of that electricity can actually be diverted to the transport system, how much, similarly with sustainable fuels, how much can we produce sustainably, have we got enough to go around heat and transport and the air and so on and so forth. And you do that real kind of holistic modelling, and you see that even if we pulled every single lever and threw a lot more money at it right now, we would still need some quite significant transitions in lifestyles. So in other words, in how much travelling is actually in the system. We just cannot do it all with technology now. And the later we leave it with the technology, the more we push the targets back and so on, the more we've actually got to change behaviourally in order to compensate. So unfortunately, the answer is a bit, well, we need to do it all, but we really do need to do it all. And because we've left the technological transition longer than we could have done, should have done, it means now we've got to have even stronger or deeper changes to lifestyles as well.
Sigrid, are you playing catch up then? I mean, how are you trying to drive up and accelerate tech and innovation in the car industry, and where is it coming from?
Now, the car industry, the auto industry, and as I say, we represent also truck and bus and coach manufacturers. We're the biggest private investor in R&D in Europe, with over 60 billion euros each year, and together on electrification alone, over 250 billion euros. That's really massive. That's more than the GDP of some of the EU member states. So just to put it into perspective, so I think we are very good at innovation and technological advances. It's also how we compete with other regions in the world. And technology can indeed help. And I think it's indeed also important to remind ourselves, and Jillian just did as well, that it's not just about greening the vehicles, but also making them smarter. So it's a digital and a green transformation that we're in, because also making traffic more efficient, for example, that's good for the environment. It reduces emissions, but it also makes traffic safer if it's smoother. It reduces the time that people need to spend in traffic. You need different traffic modes to work together. It's individual mobility, but also collective mobility, and the last mile in transport and logistics is an example of that too. So you need a very smooth system working together, and you need to also cater for different needs. You need to cater for city needs, urban areas, but also rural areas and everything in between. So there's really not a one solution fits all solution here, and that's what makes it so difficult. So we understand, and we also are firmly behind electrifying the car fleet. It's very important. It's a crucial solution, but also electrification alone will not do the job. Be it because of all those vehicles that are currently running around and that also need to decarbonize, but also because it doesn't serve all, again, mobility needs in all areas and all corners of Europe. So we need to keep an open mind. Technology neutrality is not a hollow thing. It's really meaningful. It stimulates innovation, and it will also help us to get to solving the problem of decarbonization, because I firmly am on the same page as Jillian is. We need to do everything at the same time, and we don't have a lot of time.
Because, Sigrid, you say you're good at innovation and technology in your sector, but there are other countries on the face of it that are doing better. China, for example, the European Commission announced a probe last week into electric cars. Why point the finger at China if they're maybe just better and faster at innovation than Europe?
Well, they have a competitive edge when it comes to the electrification of the vehicle fleet. And part of the reason is that they could never catch up on combustion engine technology. That's, it's a very mature, very advanced technology, very clean also at the moment, the latest technology there. So it's a clear industrial strategy of China to focus on electrification in the auto industry and to build up for their domestic economy, first of all, global players. These global players are now in need of exporting, and Europe is a very open market. And also regulation is ambitious here. So they come to market here. They are absolutely formidable competitors, but I wouldn't say that they are a better or they have beaten already the Europeans and the Americans. We need to see that. They're formidable competitors, and there are indeed also issues with how competitive the European economy is, how competitive the American economy is, and the rules of the game deployed by China. So yeah, what we believe is important is that we focus on Europe's own competitive strength. In that sense, the signal that the Commission has given is that they take that seriously. Let's now look at a holistic approach with all these enabling conditions, also access to crucial materials and components for those that want to manufacture in Europe, which is lacking at the moment. And we've been reliant on oil for a long time. We are now pretty reliant on materials for batteries coming into Europe from, for example, China. Those are important questions that we also need to consider and take into account when making policy, and then also when building the business case. Okay. So again, no simple answers here to a very complex situation and issue.
Okay, Sigrid, thank you. Herald at the European Commission. I just want to stick with the China aspect for a moment. The Chinese government denounced Ursula von der Leyen's announcement last week of this probe, in their words, and I quote, "a naked protectionist act." Is that what it is? And is there going to be a trade war? We've been here before, haven't we?
I think, Damon, that the Commission has collected quite ample data and evidence from public sources and also from specialized database on the existence of quite a large range of Chinese subsidies, as well as a threat of injury to the EU industry. And we are an open market, but at the same time, we need to have, of course, guaranteeing the rules being observed. So it is evidence that will lead us to a investigation of injuries.
But could there be a trade war over this?
I think that
I would say no.
You would say no. Okay. Sorry, Harold. What would you say? Yeah.
No, sorry, I'm not speaking about a trade war at all. I'm simply saying that the Commission has certain evidence, and that the President announced last week that we will look into that evidence. And for that, we have legislation well established, and we need to do that in order to protect, of course, the markets, but in a balanced way.
But some people would say that Europe has contributed to China becoming the factory for the world. So it's a bit of an ironic situation, isn't it?
I don't think it's an ironic situation if there is a situation that you can find through evidence that there is a subsidization that is going on. and which is not in sync with the rules that we have established in the Union.
And what does it mean for those EU countries that have tie-ups with China? Could it affect them? And how would you manage that in the European Union?
I think, again, as I said, that there is an open market, and that we have, of course, there to protect that market at the same time. And I think that is a very clear message from the president, and we are into the investigation, and we'll see.
Okay. All right, Hemant, I'd like to go over to you now, IATA, to talk a little bit more about aviation. We mentioned earlier on the use of new aviation fuels in the future, sustainable aviation fuels, also known as SAF. While we're talking about technology and where it comes from and who's innovating, who's innovating around that at the moment, and where's your focus with SAF?
So SAF right now is actually, it's quite a small percentage in terms of total volumes, which is available. In 2022, it was about 0.1% of the total jet fuel uplift. So it's a small percentage of the overall volume itself. And we need to really scale up, because this is our major enabler. We have quite a few boutique providers. We have probably 6 refineries in Europe, 4 in the US right now, 1 in Singapore, which is capable of producing SAF. We are seeing scale up. I can project over 130 capabilities by 2028 in terms of refining capacity. But we need to make sure that SAF is a viable output, a commercial output from these refineries, because there will be competition with other products, including renewable diesel as well. So we need balanced policies from governments as well.
Because there are figures, aren't there? I got some figures from the EU Aviation Safety Agency. They say current supplies of these alternative aviation fuels, currently 0.05% of total EU aviation fuel use. 0.05. There's a lot of work to do there, isn't there?
There is a lot of work. I'm not sure on that particular figure, but I can absolutely agree with you that there's a lot of work to be done on this, and we need scale up. And for that, we need.
So what are you doing about it? Yeah.
Airlines, let me be very clear about this. Airlines have purchased every drop of fuel, SAF, which is available. So, it's really a question of how to boost production. There's a few boutique providers, suppliers out there as well. We need the big energy companies to also ramp up in terms of SAF production as well. It's really, really important going forward. And I think we also need to understand what's happening on a global scale as well. For example, in the US, you have the Inflation Reduction Act as well. That's enabling a lot of development, technology development, research development, and also supporting the actual the procurement of SAF itself as well. So there's a lot of enabling policy aspects out there as well. And we need to think how best Europe can actually best fit into that equation as well. One point I do want to make is that aviation, as I mentioned before, is global. We need solutions. Yes, of course, in terms of what we're talking about here, we also need to consider the competitiveness of the European industry. But the atmosphere is not precious about national borders or regional borders. And we need to find solutions which are workable across the globe as well. This is the balance we need. There's no easy solution to thinking about this, really. Yes, we do need industries to move forward. We need competition and I say we need functioning markets. But at the same time, you cannot have a situation where we're impeding global solutions to move towards addressing climate impacts, right?
Yeah, sure. Sigrid, on these alternative fuels that Hemant has been talking about, Lufthansa reportedly hit out at the automaking industry recently, saying, if you think you're going to get your hands on those kind of fuels, think again, because we haven't got enough to go around. We need it for aviation. You can't have it in the automaking industry, was basically the essence of what they were saying. There's a bit of a sort of fight going on between the mobility sectors then, is there?
Well, as I tried to say before, I think all solutions are needed in all transport modes because they're very different mobility and transportation needs.
But are you working together?
Yeah, I think rather than playing us against each other, it would be more efficient to have a carbon price and work with that. And the renewable fuels will play an important role in decarbonizing the overall transport sector. And that's in addition, in our particular case, to the switch towards zero-emission vehicles, so that's electric vehicles. I think for the existing cars on the roads, renewable fuels are incredibly important because they will need to contribute to decarbonization as well. And then you have also the issue of scaling up demand for these renewable fuels. The scale of the automotive and the road transport market is such that it's very interesting for those that invest in developing these fuels to also cater for that part of the mobility sector. So it's not wise to artificially create divisions between the modes. Let's deal with it in a smart way. And today the links are not very well established, and then there's talk of competition. But I think in the end we shouldn't be talking about competing for these fuels, but really making sure they're readily available at an affordable price and they can use by all those modes, because then we're actually dealing with the problem.
Okay, Sigrid, thank you. Herald, at the European Commission, the EU lawmakers very recently approved these new rules requiring airlines to use more sustainable fuels, like Hemant was talking about, the share needing to be 70% by 2050. Against this backdrop of people in different sectors fighting over the limited amount of fuels that are available, how do you expect that to be achieved?
First of all, I think that we have done something quite brilliant in the union, because we have finally made a stop to this chicken and egg discussion. Like, are these airlines going to buy, and are the fuels going to be available? And finally, we have a framework with a deadline. And now, of course, the producer of those fuels can really have a certainty, a level playing field that was asked for so long. And airlines have the clear obligation, and then these two can be matched. And it's not only for airlines; we have similar discussions for maritime, and of course also for the car and the truck and bus industries. So we have a very clear view that we had to break that deadlock. I mean, it's been for too long that we have been trying to come to conclusions in certain sectors. Now, what is important here, and that was also the debate we were just having, is that we see very clearly that there are certain solutions available, notably for car and vans, and designing already quite clearly also for trucks and buses, but that for maritime and for aviation, we really need to push up much stronger. So there, I really think that there's also these technologies that are now emerging and which are now proven to be valid, are really pushed to those sectors that need it most, like maritime and aviation. Otherwise, we are going to come into a crunch, and that is not what we should be doing.
Yeah. Jillian, anything to add on this briefly?
Well, just say I completely agree with Herald there, and I have to say I do disagree with Sigrid. I think, when you quoted the statistic of 0.05% of European aviation fuels are currently from these sustainable fuels, that's against a growing growth of aviation. That these fuels are only going to we're going to be running to stand still. It's still going to be 0.05% in a few years' time, because aviation is growing at the moment. Yeah. Okay, and there is a competition. It is a competition. There are supply lines to consider where we're going to invest in those, where the vehicle innovation and the innovation around vehicles and so on. Where are we going to concentrate? If we try and sort of have a free for all, we're going to waste resources. And it's not just a competition within the transport sector, it's a competition between transport and heating, for instance, as well. We've got, real challenges in other sectors of the economy. We cannot make enough of this stuff. It is only net zero at the end of the day. It's not even zero carbon. So let's just be really sensible and strong about this and direct it to where it needs to go.
Hemant at IATA, Jillian's got a point here, hasn't she? Because actually, airlines are growing routes like there's no tomorrow. Travellers during the pandemic said, I'm not going to fly as much after the pandemic. I'm going to be leaner and greener. Oh, hello, they all start flying again. The pent-up demand is released. And some would say the aviation sector is encouraging all of this travel. You should be doing more, shouldn't you, to limit the way that people are flying and travelling?
Well, I mean, just going back to what Jillian was saying, actually, when we look at the projections for sustainable aviation fuels, we are seeing that there is going to be a significant ramp up available in terms of refining capacity. Now,
but Jillian's saying it's always going to be a case that you're going to have lots more people flying and you're going to be playing catch up.
Yes, but indeed, but the ramp up is far greater than the traffic growth projections. It's not linked in that sense at all. So,
but do you think it's acceptable that people still fly domestically within countries, for example? I mean, shouldn't we be cutting back on that?
we basically need to find every opportunity we can to actually make sure that we can move towards net zero. Now, but we also need to remember the majority of CO2 emissions come from the medium and longer haul traffic as well. So we need to find those solutions. And I think, we need to avoid being distracted by having small solutions, which may actually reduce CO2 some impact, but we need bigger solutions which are going to change the actual game itself. Now, but one thing I do want to emphasize is it's about policy as well. We need to make sure that there is, as I said, sufficient output of SAF from the refineries, and that does mean there needs to be balanced policies between the different modes. So that there's a policy aspect which can enable all of this, and I think that's important.
Jillian, do consumers, travellers, passengers, car buyers, truck drivers, do they care about the environment and sustainability, and how much of this is on them?
I mean, they care to a certain extent. They certainly care about the environment. There's no question. It's not in our interest not to care. The problem is that quite rationally, in many ways, people are waiting for direction. They're actually, contrary to political thinking, as we've seen yesterday in Britain, what people actually want to see is a level playing field where they think that if I do this thing, then I'm going to see everybody else do it. It's not just going to be me that's a mug and goes for this new technology, but that it's happening everywhere, sort of fairly and evenly and steadily, and people can see the progress and they can trust in that sort of longer term process. So they want it to happen, but we should. It
also needs to be accessible, though, right?
Individual consumers need to see consistency. They need to look out of their window and think, yes, I can see there's a crisis, because this is now what we're being sort of made to do, or firmly encouraged to do. Not inconsistent signals and confusion, and it's not a consumer issue in that sense.
Sigrid, in the car industry, for example, I mean, I was at the Munich Motor Show recently, earlier this month. Great bits of technology and innovation on show there: hydrogen cars, electric cars, all the latest models. But they're really expensive, and they're like at the top of the range of the market. BMW, Mercedes, all these other brands that were there. How do you make this transition accessible to everyone?
Yeah, that is a huge challenge, because cars are increasingly expensive because of materials that go in them, and also there are other reasons too. Safety requirements add on technology, and also cost, and they are there for a good reason. But they also need to be put in and paid for. So keeping new cars affordable for a large group of people is increasingly difficult. So that
will limit the transition, won't it?
Well, it can. Price is a main denominator indeed, and that's why purchase incentives are so important, and also incentives as to where you can park your car, or purchasing is when you buy them, and the taxation use can also mean a lot. And we've seen that also in countries that have been front runners in that respect. Large subsidies and aid did actually help the market to kick off. And we see a huge disparity within the EU when it comes to how electric vehicles are being taken up, and it's the more affluent countries where that go first. On average in Europe now, electric vehicles are most in demand. About 20% of new cars are electric vehicles, but you see many member states where the market share is still way below 10%. So that's an indication of how slow it goes. And the other main denominator is, am I able to charge my vehicle quickly? Those are the two most important points that need to be solved. People need to feel more comfortable, and then this transition will be helped.
Yeah, charging infrastructure, things like that, it's different in different places. And of course, other people have questions about how green electric cars are generally. But anyway, Hemant, I want to come back to you at IATA, representing the aviation industry. When we talk about the future, this transition, making it accessible to all, driving up tech and innovation in Europe, who's going to pay in the aviation sector? Is it going to be the passengers? Are the ticket prices going to go up? And do you think they're willing to pay more for a greener flight, a greener journey, or don't they care?
Well, I think we have to be honest. I mean, there is a cost involved with the transition, and in the end, in normal businesses, that will be passed on to the consumer in some shape or form, right? That is the case. Sustainable fuels right now are more expensive than conventional fuels. They can be a factor between 2 to 4 times at this moment in time. We expect that to reduce over time, but then of course there's also the investment in other technological solutions, airframes, and so on as well. So it will come at a cost, absolutely. Yeah.
Herald, at the European Commission, there's a lot of big questions here, isn't there, about taking everybody with you on this mobility journey to the green transition, accessibility, the costs, who pays. How can you take EU citizens with you? How can you boost accessibility and get everybody involved?
I think, like Jillian, if you look out of the window, you see what is happening. And if we see, for instance, that there are such floodings and wildfires and so on, landslides, we need to. There's no choice. And I think that citizens are more and more aware that there is no choice. So we should not compete between the sectors. I fully agree with Sigrid. We should work together hand in hand to make the best possible choices. The, let's say, energy that will be available for this transition is finite. So we cannot not be mindful about efficiencies and where we use. And that's also why we are in the Mobility Week. I mean, we are also promoting just as much cycling and walking as all the other transport modes. So we need to take citizens with us. There is, of course, a very important social side to it as well, Damon. So we have, of course, also a fund foreseen out of the ETS revenues, in particular for the people who would be suffering most from this transition, the Social Climate Fund, with 86 billion that will be available for the member states to mitigate there where it is most painful. I think that is important. But on the other hand, I mean, I'm quite confident, but I see what is happening, that we are making that change, at least in Europe, and Europe, I think, is exemplary to what it has been doing over the past 5 years.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Listen, we're drawing to a close in a few minutes, but we've had a few questions in from our audience. Thank you very much indeed for sending those in. I'm just going to quickly fire a couple of those at each of the panelists here. The first one is there any way that carbon rationing could be introduced across all goods and services? It would be fairer to poorer people than taxes and penalty charges and would encourage sustainable choices. Herald, what would you say to that?
We have been introducing now an ETS, or an emissions trading system, that is expanding to other parts of the transport sector. I think that will automatically lead to a more, I would say, rational choice, and it's a good step in this direction.
Okay, Sigrid, one for you, I think. Is there a way the EU can help countries subsidise adoption to greener transport, for example, cars?
The EU can certainly, so the European Commission can point at best practices, but taxation and also purchase incentives are national competences. So it's up to member states and also to the pockets, how deep the pockets are of the member states to help. And that is an issue because there is disparity within the EU, and I think it's something that needs to be looked at also from a solidarity point of view, but it's not easy to solve.
Okay, let's get this final one. Cheaper green electricity would help. Winter fuel bills are too high in the UK. Is nuclear power the answer? Jillian, you're in the UK, so maybe one for you.
No, nuclear power is subsidised enormously. I mean, we haven't seen nuclear power stations get built in the last decade precisely because there hasn't been a business case for it. So we are actually paying through our taxes for nuclear energy, and it's not carbon neutral given the way it's built, what's required, what's put into it. It's also not a steady source. Nuclear power stations go offline all the time, so it has its own sort of intermittency like renewables do. So it's not actually an answer for us in our purses or for the environment, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks very much for all your questions that you sent in. Just before we wrap up, in a word from each of you, very, very briefly, the question we've been asking today is, how can Europe accelerate a zero-emission future or a net zero future? Sigrid, in a word, what needs to happen next?
Cooperation, take away as many hurdles as possible to make implementation now a reality.
Okay, Jillian?
In some ways, the opposite, very strong regulation.
Okay, Hemant?
completely the opposite to Jillian. Support technology scale up and help us develop markets so we can use the markets to move to net zero.
Okay, final word from you, Herald. Oh, we can't hear you. Just release your microphone.
We should regulate and also at the same time push up by co-funding and have a good budget for it.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for that very interesting debate. Still lots to do in terms of greening up mobility in Europe as we look to the future. Let's go around and say thanks to all of our guests. Herald Ruijters, Acting Deputy Director General at the DG Move Department at the European Commission. Thanks to you. Sigrid de Vries, Director General at the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. Thanks for joining us as well.
Thank you.
In Leeds in the UK, we have Jillian Anable, Professor of Transport and Energy at the University of Leeds. Thanks for your insights and analysis, Jillian. And last but not least, thanks to Hemant Mistry from the International Air Transport Association joining us from Geneva. Thanks, Hemant. And thank you very much indeed to all of our audience for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully lots of takeaways for you there. If you joined us part the way through and you missed some of this debate, it will be available on replay via Euronews' YouTube channel and also via the euronews.com website. So you can catch the whole thing there straight after this debate. But indeed, thank you very much indeed again for joining us. We'll see you next time for another Euronews virtual debate. Goodbye.